Good morning. Today is Tuesday, May 26th, 2020. I hope you had a nice Memorial Day holiday as you spent it remembering and celebrating, maybe doing some things a little bit differently, maybe even being able to get outside a little bit. We're getting close to that time. So today we're going to be beginning a study of the little book of Micah. Micah prophesied primarily to Judah, the southern kingdom, but he did have some things to say about the northern kingdom too. As we learn from the first two verses of the book, Micah was from Moresheth, which is believed to have been a small town southwest of Jerusalem. He tells us that he prophesied during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Just as a bit of background on the book, Jotham was a godly king. 2 Kings 15 says he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. But it also says in verse 35 of that same chapter that the high places, however, were not removed. The people continued to offer sacrifices and burnt incense there. The next king mentioned was Ahaz. We are told in 2 Kings chapter 16 that he was a wicked king. He did not do what was right in the eyes of his God. It says in verse 3, he even sacrificed his own son in the fire. That's a reference to a worship of a false god that was common in that time, where people actually took babies and offered them in the fire as sacrifices. When Ahaz was threatened by foreign nations, we're told in verse 8 of that chapter that he took the silver and gold found in the temple of the Lord and sent it as a gift to the king of Assyria, basically asking Assyria to come and rescue him. When Assyria did come and rescued, he agreed to mimic the worship of their false gods. And so he built an altar in accordance with all the plans sent from Damascus. The third king mentioned is Hezekiah. Hezekiah became king after Ahab, and it was during the reign of Hezekiah that the northern kingdom of Israel was defeated and deported by Assyria. Hezekiah was a godly king. 2 Kings 18 verse 3 tells us he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. It says he removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. Verse 5 and following tell us that there was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He held fast to the Lord and did not stop following him. He kept the commands of the Lord that the Lord had given Moses, and the Lord was with him. It was also during the reign of Hezekiah that Sennacherib of Assyria laid siege to Jerusalem. Hezekiah called out to the Lord, and God responded by sending the angel of the Lord through the camp of Assyria, putting to death 185,000 of the troops. It is also Hezekiah who, when he got very sick and was told he would die, prayed to the Lord, and God granted him 15 more years of life. So that's a little bit of background on what's going on during the time of Micah. Some good, but a lot of bad too. With that, let's take a look at what God had to say about it all through Micah. Verse 1, Micah chapter 1, beginning at verse 1, says there, the word of the Lord that came to Micah of Moresheth during the reign of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, the vision he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Notice that Micah says that God gave him the vision. I don't know what that may have been like, but it was a common way that God communicated with his prophets during that time. Does God still communicate in that sort of way? I sometimes hear people say things like, God told me, or other things like that. I have no doubt that God may very well speak to some people in very distinct ways, be it visions, strong feelings, maybe even a voice. But the Bible makes it clear that our responsibility, if we receive some sort of guidance, is to first make sure that it is indeed from the Lord. 1 John 4, verse 1 says, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. Too many times I have seen believers led astray by these false prophets or false spirits. In our passage from Micah, Micah recognizes God's message and passes it on as a prophet is called to do. He continues in verse 2, "Hear, you people, all of you, listen, earth and all who live in it. That is that the sovereign Lord may bear witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple." After Micah tells us the time frame of his message, he affirms who the message is to and who it is from. Look what he says. He directs his message to earth and all who live in it. That includes us. Many times when we read a passage like this, we are inclined to think that it is meant for another place or another time. Here, Micah tells us that it is to you and to I, and says, listen, God has something to say. Notice also that Micah makes it clear that this message is from the one true God, the God of their forefathers, the sovereign Lord, and that this God has some complaints. He continues in verse 3, "Look, the Lord is coming from his dwelling place. He comes down and treads on the heights of the earth. The mountains melt beneath him and the valleys split apart like wax before the fire, like water rushing down a slope. All of this is because of Jacob's transgression, because of the sins of the people of Israel." Micah reminds us who we are dealing with by telling us a bit about the glorious nature of God. He says that the mountains melt, the valleys split, and that this God is coming to them. And why? He said it's because of their transgressions, their sins. In today's world, we don't usually think of God in those ways. It is said that we live in a time of grace, during which God is being patient, not wanting any to perish. As a result, we sometimes forget that God is a just God. And in a time of judgment will come. Micah asks, somewhat tongue in cheek, I'm sure, what are the sins that God is so upset about? He says at the end of verse 5, what is Jacob's transgression? Is it not Samaria? What is Judah's high place? Is it not Jerusalem? We see that he answers his question by responding Samaria and Jerusalem. The implications are significant and should not be missed. He says, what is Jacob's transgression? Jacob was their forefather. He was the father of the 12 tribes. When God led them out of Egypt, he gave them Jerusalem as a special place to gather to worship. But now, many years later, they were not a united people. They were two separate kingdoms that sometimes fought with each other. So when Micah responds that Samaria is Jacob's transgression, note Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom and an alternate place to worship, he's saying that that division is not part of God's plan, that they were to be one nation that came together to worship in Jerusalem. And when he asks, what is Judah's high place? It's a reference to the false religions and the false gods that were worshipped in Jerusalem. The implication is that the worship in Jerusalem was not God honoring and that God was not willing to accept it. Micah goes on to tell what God is going to do about it. He says in verse 6, therefore I will make Samaria a heap of rubble, a place for planting vineyards. I will pour her stones into the valley and lay bare her foundations. All her idols will be broken to pieces. All her temple gifts will be burned with fire. I will destroy all her images. Since she gathered her gifts from the wages of prostitutes, as the wages of prostitutes, they will again be used. This is a vivid description of the devastation that did come on the northern kingdom during the life of Micah. God fulfilled this prophecy in a very specific way. And it was all because of the sin that they refused to repent of. But let's not forget that Micah opened his book by directing the message to us too. We live in a time that is not unlike the time of Micah. People have distorted worship. People have served other gods. People have refused to repent and turn to the sovereign Lord for forgiveness. Instead, we just keep molding our gods into the sort of gods that suit our purpose. Micah's message to us is clear. Turn to the Lord. Seek forgiveness. Now, I don't want to assume that I know what is inside your heart. What I've said is meant in a general way, but it is very important that we all look in the mirror and allow God to convict us in those areas where conviction is needed. I hope that you will do that today and that you will meet God in a very real and significant way. God bless you. Have a great week.